welcome back. So this is video 4 of Design and Technology Preliminary Theory, and today I'm going to talk about section 2.1 of the syllabus. This is probably the first section of the syllabus that gets a little bit all over the place. The first couple of sections are very obvious that do with the design process and the factors affecting design, and this one is kind of getting into a comparison with your practical and project work. So the idea behind this is, what are those processes in the design industry that exist? What are those ways that we go from start to finish in domestic settings, so home settings, small businesses, and then commercial runs? And how can we parallel those with versions of our major design project? So our major design project is essentially usually going to end up being a one-off prototype. You might even go so far as to patent that, but generally you're not going to end up doing a mass-produced run of whatever it is that you're making. So what are the differences between going into industry and making something and comparing that to, things at home, and looking at small boutique industries and those kind of things that really would mirror kind of the way that you're working. So there's a lot of talk in books about things like cottage industries. So cottage industries being like these pre-industrial revolution, so little places where people make sort of things one-offs, all of that. Like a blacksmith that works within a medieval village or something. They create pieces as needed for a small area. The Industrial Revolution comes along and we start doing factories and production lines and basically making things en masse in areas and then transporting them out to other areas. So, each village doesn't make its own automobiles. You have one factory somewhere that makes it, and then those get taken out. And realistically at this point, mass production and the Industrial Revolution and shipping lanes and all of those sorts of things have made it so it's much cheaper to make things in other countries and then transport it over. So we've gone from, really localized production and design to really having globalization where one product goes out to everyone. It's the same iPhone in America as it is here in Australia. So when we talk about that and we start with the cottage industry, it's all about how you don't use special tools, really. You've got some things, maybe hammers, basic stuff, and it works, and you make things, weaving, all of that sort of stuff. So, using materials that are locally found, not having anything that's ultra specialized, and then maybe you have a shop front. So that doesn't mean that it's necessarily old-fashioned. So there's modern things like Etsy, which is an internet site that basically deals with cottage industry and small businesses. That's not to say that you can't do things on Etsy that have, really specialized tools. There's a lot of laser cut pieces on there, for example. But, as we're saying, like as a good example of ways that things can do it, you can have a virtual storefront. You don't just have to have, something out the front of your house. So we start off really small with that. And then we get to a community setting. So domestic, we're talking about it's just in the house, and there's nothing that says that you can't have a cake business or something as well. We're not just talking about weaving baskets and all that sort of stuff. It's through the whole set of a design and business idea. So you've got that. That's really small. Cottage industry, very tiny. That's what we would call domestic in the syllabus. Then we get to a community design setting, and that's still sort of the same thing. But it kind of expands a little bit. So a backyard business then becomes a small local business. So instead of just one person making something little, it's successful, it expands, and that's where a lot of small businesses kind of start. You might hire on some more people. It might become just a full-time job for you instead of something that you do on the side. And it kind of builds from there. So there are lots of current businesses that do that, maybe a bit less than in 30 years ago because of globalization and the internet closing down small businesses. But, like a lawnmower repair store. There's one down the street from where I live. That's a small business. They do design and modifications to those sorts of things. They have special tools. They hire on a few people. That's something like that. But you could also say that small boutique industries, So, a small fashion label that runs out of like local Australian clothing, or in the musical instrument industry, you know, a small guitar maker or somebody that makes boutique effect pedals, they're going to be the sorts of things we're talking about in a community setting. We're not talking about a large multinational corporation or company. We're not talking about something that's a massive company that employs hundreds of people. We're talking about a community business that really hires local people. So you've got backyard, cottage business, domestic, local. Then you've got your mid-range business, which is your small business. It's probably got like, you know, one outlet. There might be another person a couple of towns over that's doing something similar. There may not be. You know, it can still be a global thing as well with, you know, lots of little people, especially. I use my music industry example because I know about that. There's lots of tiny little guitar pedal makers all over the world. They're all doing something similar. They interact with one another, but they're not really the same business. Moving on then, and above that we get into sort of an industrial setting. Now the biggest thing about an industrial setting is you've got really specialized tools. You might have robotics, automation, all that sort of stuff, and it allows you to make things on scale. When you're doing something small in terms of, you know, a backyard industry or even a small business, you're probably just going to not be making the amount of product that you would need. So when you're making this product and manufacturing on a large scale, the machines that you're making are specialized for the purpose. So, you know, you might have a robot in a car factory that just puts the doors on the car. It saves you, you know, maybe 5 to 10 minutes for each car that goes through. It probably costs, you know, several $100,000 at least, maybe even like millions to make that machine in the first place. But now it speeds up those repetitive tasks and it makes things more efficient and faster, which means you get more product out, which is great if people actually want the product. If you're, you know, making hundreds of thousands of cars a year and nobody wants them, this is not a viable design and business model. But, you know, as things speed up and those things happen, then we can move our people onto the tasks that require people. You know, if something is a repetitive task like doing bolts up all the time, it makes sense to automate that process. So, you know, the biggest idea of an industrial process that everyone knows about is automotive manufacturing, so car making. So the Henry Ford makes the production line and his cars speed out of the factory much faster than when they were being made one by one. Each person or each thing does a repetitive task and then it moves on. So each piece is specialized, so they're able to, not one person isn't making an entire car. So there's not 100 people making 100 cars all separately. There's 100 people making one car in 1/100th of the time. Then they just repeat the process over and over again. And what that means is everybody gets really good at the one thing that they're doing, and your product is able to be made cheaper and more efficiently and probably better, to be honest. So when that's happening, you start to use, as I've said before, specialized tools. So, you know, when you've got access to this mass production, you can, use molding of plastic and extrusion. So that's when you can use vacuum forming. So you heat up plastic and then you pull it down and it sucks through and makes a mold. You can use injection molding, where you have another plate and plastic gets heated up and then kind of pushed inside it or injected into it, and that can give you those plastic shapes that would be really hard to make otherwise. You've got slightly more modern things like rapid prototyping with 3D printers and that sort of stuff. So when you've got all of these tools, a lot of those may be very useful in your backyard process if you can afford it, but they're more affordable in the industrial processes when you've got, lots of products coming out and therefore lots of money. But even in these sort of commercial settings, you've got different tiers of the way that people design. So some businesses will go completely custom. So they'll make pieces one at a time. They'll make them handcrafted. So it'll almost be like those backyard businesses, but with the industrial tools. So those are great, but oftentimes it's much more expensive to do because you've got to make your molds, you've got to make your tooling, you've got to do all of those things. So if I make a die to injection mold, so I make a metal set of plates that I can inject plastic into, it's going to cost me heaps to make the initial dies, but after that it's only a couple of cents for the plastic to be injected in to make it work. So each piece becomes cheaper the more that you make. If you're making a one-off, it's often cost prohibitive and it'll be quite expensive. So you might be making it one-off in a business. You might choose to do a batch lot or a job lot. So that's like where I'll make 50 pieces and then I'll sell those pieces and then I'll make 50 more if the demand was there. So what that means is I can keep my costs down by, making that die or whatever it is that I'm doing, injecting the plastic in, making a bunch of them, but I'm not continuously making more if there's not demand. So I'm not setting up the machines forever just for my process. I might even go and rent out some machines or outsource to another company to do it for me. I might be working continuously, so I might just be going, if there's that much, I'm just working all the time. I might even have my factory geared up for 24 hours. So I could make one-off, I could do batches, or I could just go all the time. And when things are going all the time, it tends to work more smoothly. You're not having to start up your machines and close them down. You're not wasting sort of pieces. Oftentimes, the first few pieces when you put through a machine aren't as good, so it becomes wastage. I've worked in a record making factory before, making vinyl records for a little bit, and the first few presses are always they're bad. They sound bad. That then becomes recycled, but the recycled vinyl never sounds as good as the other ones, so then you move those over to the cheaper ones. Like, there's a lot of wastage. If you can keep your machine going and heat it up all the time, you have better quality outcomes. So how do you manage a business in this case? Well, so essentially, management can work in two ways. You can work in terms of profit. So you can say, if I'm making profit, I'm doing well, and I need to consistently make good profit, and that is fine. If you're not making profit in a business, then there's no point in having a business. Your design is a failure, and you need to change things. That's really all that it comes down to at the end of the day. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're not financially viable, it doesn't work. So even if you're doing an amazing thing that's helping all of the people around the world, if it's not financially viable, it's not a good design. So obviously you can make a non-financially viable design if you have grants and people willing to make it financially viable. But if you as a designer are consistently losing money, it's a bad design. So value-based management is this idea that profit comes first. And investors like that sort of thing. That's really one of the ways that stocks go higher. If you're making money consistently and year on year for your company, then you're probably doing a good job in terms of investors. But some of the ways that you can make money are by decreasing the quality of your product, which is good short term, but usually not good in the end. So that could be through moving from a custom based model to something that's very production line based. Sometimes that can remove some of the quality points of why people like your product in the first place. It's just things that you need to think about. Okay, so when we're talking about technology and we're bringing that across, so we've talked about the 3 different industries at this point, but what technology you use depends hugely on the workforce, it depends on the techniques that you're going to be using, and it depends on what it is that you're actually going to be making. So if you're working from a home style factory, you use whatever tools are available to you. If you have access to a table saw, you use a table saw. If you don't, then you can't. And that's as simple as it is, all right? If you are using a commercial factory, you'll have access to more tools, but things will probably be more streamlined as a result. So if you're making custom furniture in a large industrial factory, sometimes you won't have access to the sort of custom features that you would have if you were going to be a designer in a small factory. So, I compare a hand saw to a CNC router. Hand saw can cut wood perfectly. CNC router can cut wood perfectly. If you have a CNC router in your backyard business, great. You can do lots more complex things quickly compared to doing it by hand. But that's not to say that you can't make a complex piece of woodwork just using hand tools. It just takes longer. And so you would need to charge a client accordingly for that. But some people want the customization from hand tools. I'm not saying that either of these are good or bad. But regardless of the tools that you want, there is a step through the design process. And this is where we get to the second part and the part that's confusing. So why am I teaching you all of this? It's because we want to make a comparison between how it works in industry and how it works in your design and technology projects. So just like that, the general steps of the design process, you identify a need, you design, you do your concept sketches. Once that product design or whatever it is you're making is concrete, then you start with your working final drawings. So those are the things that are really sort of measured. They've got all your dimensioning on it. They look, they're not just quick hand sketches. You're using rulers, you're using CAD tools, whatever it is you're using. After that, you build your prototype. Now, for most of your high school projects, that's kind of where it ends. You build a prototype, but you're not going to take it to market. So after you've built your prototype, you hand it into your markers and you're good to go. If it did get taken up though and made, then you would move on to your next step. Well, you would order mass materials. If you were going on a really big scale, you would need to rent out a factory space. You would need to set up your tooling and all your machines. You would need to do job runs and practice runs and all of those sort of things to get into full-scale production. And then once production starts, you then need to make sure that the quality is there. So you need to do quality control tests. So we end like here at like a third of the way through the design process. We never go into a production run. After you've made it, you also need to store and sell your products. So all of these things cost money and they need to be aligned into your financial ideas of how much you sell a product for. So as a designer in high school, we kind of stop before we know if the product is actually going to work. Like, is it realistic based on all of those post-design things? Do we need to charge more money? There's all of that sort of stuff as well. So that's, and those costs are really high. So I can't stress enough how much initial material and tool setups are. You can pay hundreds of thousands of dollars easily just getting your machines set up, and then you need to rent your machines or buy your machines as well. Essentially, you need to keep creating to get the profit back in to make it. But sometimes designs aren't viable on this step. You can talk about this in your portfolio, but I think it's really beyond the scale of what you're being asked to do in this course. So when we produce, we document our production in ways like action plans. So all of those steps that I went through before, that's an action plan. We get very detailed on our action plans because you need to be detailed on all of the steps. You miss out on a step, then your product doesn't work. If you've gone through this production process and you've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on tooling and it just doesn't work, then you've lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you document to, first off, cover yourself as a designer, but also to notice things that you may not have noticed otherwise. And the major design project with the portfolio is our example of that. It's kind of, like I've said before, it's an emulation of the design process. And it's not perfect, but we want to get as close as we can to the industry. So looking at that sort of thing, I think if you're going to be spending all this money in a commercial setting, you need to really do your need analysis well. So this is one of the main issues that I come across with students in design and technology is there's not actually a need for their project, or they've made it up. So they might go, I want to make something because I'm really into a certain activity. But if it already exists and you're not making it significantly better, in the real world, it's probably not going to work. You need to think about all those tooling and production costs, all the things like that, and then how many are you actually going to sell? And if you need to make the price too high to make it sell, then you need to sell a lot. We need to think of different design solutions, and that can be confusing. So when we're selecting the processes that we're going to do, when we're selecting the need, we need to make sure that we're always working with a time plan, with an action plan, to all of those things, so we don't waste time on something that isn't going to work from the start. We need to do our research properly before we start thinking of the solution. So I know for me as well, for me definitely, I struggle not to jump straight to the solution. But you need to define your problem first, really define it properly. Come up with a solution to that problem, and then come up with the product that solves the solution. So if the problem is littering, as an example, don't just jump straight to a different type of bin. You need to look at why people are littering, and then you need to work out how you can distill it down to a simple idea. And then, because if we were to scale this up to a production process, in a industrial setting, making all of the tooling to make a different sort of bin or something like that would be quite expensive, and it might actually be cost prohibitive. If people don't take it up, then your design, as good as it is, could be judged to be a failure. Okay, so I mean, we got off on a little bit of a tangent there, but hopefully that kind of makes sense, that there's those three sort of areas of design, and the processes have to be different based on budget and access to materials and tools.